You learned to stay quiet not because you had nothing to say, but because somewhere along the way you were taught that silence was safer than honesty. Maybe it started in your home, where speaking up meant being dismissed or punished. Maybe it happened in church, where every time you questioned something, you were told you lacked faith. Maybe it happened in relationships, where your boundaries were seen as rebellion, and your truth as inconvenience. So you folded yourself into a smaller version of who you were, all in the name of peace. And for a while, it worked. People were more comfortable, conversations were easier, conflicts were avoided. You became agreeable, soft-spoken, the peacemaker. But something inside you began to fade, not all at once, and not loud. It was subtle, like a light dimming, like music fading in the background of a room you used to love. And one day, you realized this peace you worked so hard to maintain doesn't even feel like yours anymore. Because the truth is, it wasn't peace, it was silence. And silence, when forced, becomes a prison, not a virtue. You thought you were being godly. You thought you were being humble. But the more you silenced yourself, the more disconnected you became. Not just from others, but from you. And now, you find yourself in a strange place. You're present, but you're not fully there. You go through the motions, but your soul feels muted. You agree with things you no longer believe. You say yes when every part of you is begging to say no. You nod to keep the peace, but the noise inside your heart is growing louder with each passing day. It's not rebellion. It's not pride. It's your soul asking to be heard. But you've been quiet for so long, you're not even sure how to find your voice anymore. And here's where it gets more complicated. The world, even the church, often celebrates this kind of silence. They call it meekness. They call it submission. They call it obedience. But God never asked you to trade your voice for validation. You were made in the image of a speaking God. The same God who spoke light into darkness, who spoke to prophets, to widows, to the broken, who sent His word in flesh, not to stay silent, but to proclaim good news. Your voice was never a threat to peace. It was always meant to carry it. But somewhere along the journey, peace became a mask, not a reality. And masks, even spiritual ones, will suffocate the soul if you wear them too long. So now you live with a quiet ache. You wonder why no one really knows you, why your relationships feel one-sided, why you feel invisible in places that once felt safe. And the reason is simple, even if it's hard. You've trained the world to accept your silence. You've taught others that your needs are small, that your truth is flexible, that your boundaries are negotiable, that you'll go along, no matter what it costs. But inside, you've been paying the price, with your joy, with your clarity, with your emotional health, with your identity. And now, maybe for the first time, you're starting to ask the question, who am I when I'm not trying to keep everyone else comfortable? It's a hard question. Because the truth is, the peaceful version of you has been praised. They like the quiet you, the compliant you, the always agreeing you. But that version wasn't full. It was functioning. And functioning is not the same as living. Your silence may have created peace for others, but it created war within you. And now, the war is surfacing in unexpected ways. You snap at small things. You feel anxious for no reason. You cry when no one is watching. You wake up tired, even when you've slept. You feel numb in places where you used to feel alive. These are not signs of disobedience. They're signals. Signals that something sacred in you has been silenced for too long. And the most dangerous part? You've gotten used to it. Used to not being heard. Used to not expressing how you feel. Used to being overlooked. Used to fading into the background so no one is uncomfortable. But what about your comfort? What about your voice? What about your truth? When did your soul become something you had to hide to keep everyone else at peace? Because God never asked you to be invisible. He asked you to be honest. And honesty, when done in love, doesn't destroy peace. It births real peace. Peace that doesn't depend on your silence, but on your truth. And that kind of peace? It won't cost you yourself. So maybe the next step isn't speaking loudly. Maybe it's just speaking at all. Not with force, not with rage, not to dominate, but to exist again. To say, I feel this. To whisper, I need this. To admit, that hurt me. To name, that crossed a line. That is not weakness. That is healing. And maybe that's the beginning of something sacred. Not the death of peace, but the resurrection of your own soul. You thought it was maturity. You thought it was wisdom. You thought it was what God expected from you. To let it go, to not speak up, to say, it's fine, when it wasn't. To forgive immediately, even when the wound was still fresh. To agree, even when something inside of you quietly disagreed. And people called it beautiful. They praised your composure. They said you were so humble, so easy to work with, so full of grace. But grace isn't the same as erasure. And somewhere along the line, what looked like submission became a silent kind of self-abandonment. It didn't happen overnight. It happened in small moments. Moments where you had an opinion, but stayed quiet to keep the room calm. Moments where you felt pain, but smiled so others wouldn't feel guilty. Moments where you disagreed, but said nothing because it wasn't worth it. And after enough of those moments, your soul stopped raising its hand. It learned, slowly and silently, that its voice didn't matter as much as everyone else's comfort. This isn't something we talk about often in faith circles, because submission is often praised, especially for women. Because peacekeeping is often mistaken for peacemaking. Because silence has been labeled as virtue, even when it comes from fear. But God never asked you to disappear in the name of spiritual order. He never told you to become less of who you are so someone else could feel more at ease. He never required you to say yes to things that fractured your heart. He never celebrated silence that was born from fear instead of wisdom. The Jesus we follow didn't silence himself to maintain appearances. He spoke truth, even when it disrupted systems. He flipped tables, not out of pride, but out of protection for the unseen. He wept in public. He groaned out loud. He questioned. He expressed pain, frustration, anger, compassion, fully and without apology. And yet, you've been taught that expression is dangerous, that asking too many questions is doubt, that honesty is rebellion, that boundaries are selfish, that advocating for your own well-being is prideful. So you surrendered your voice in the name of false peace, and now you barely recognize the sound of your own soul when it tries to speak. You wonder why you feel distant from God. But how can you hear the whisper of the Spirit when you've been taught to ignore your own? When every instinct, every nudge, every internal no is treated as unspiritual, you begin to believe that discernment is disobedience, that the small voice inside you, the one you used to trust, must be silenced too. But that voice was a gift. It was never meant to be shut down. It was meant to be sharpened through time, through truth, through communion with God. Instead, It was silenced by systems, by relationships, by fear wrapped in scripture, by cultural ideas that confuse submission with suppression. You told yourself, "I'm just being obedient." But obedience to man at the cost of your soul is not obedience to God. You told yourself, "I don't want to cause division." But division doesn't come from honesty. It comes from dishonesty pretending to be harmony. You told yourself, "I'm keeping the peace." But peace without truth isn't peace. It's pretense. And here's what most people won't say. True submission in the kingdom of God never asks you to vanish. It asks you to trust, to yield, to align, not to human pressure, but to divine presence. And sometimes, God's presence will lead you to say the uncomfortable thing, to draw the needed line, to protect your soul instead of sacrificing it. This is not rebellion. This is reverence for the image of God in you. And that image is not passive. It speaks, it shapes, it declares, it creates, it stands up when needed, it walks away when needed. It says yes with courage and no with clarity. But when all you've known is appeasement, finding your no can feel like failure. It can feel like you're letting people down, like you're being difficult, like you're losing your witness, but you're not. You're learning to honor the divine design within you, the one that includes voice, value, conviction, intuition. And yes, it's awkward at first, shaky, scary, unfamiliar. The first time you say, "That doesn't work for me," your stomach might turn. The first time you tell someone, "Actually, I disagree," your hands might tremble. The first time you admit, "I've been holding this in for years," you might feel exposed. But those moments are sacred. They are not signs of disobedience. They are signs of resurrection. The slow, beautiful return of the voice you buried under religious expectations. And as that voice rises again, so does something else. Your confidence, your clarity, your ability to feel peace without silence, to feel spiritual without disappearing, to feel aligned with God without abandoning yourself. Because God never asked you to choose between being real and being righteous. He asked you to follow Him in spirit and in truth, and truth always begins within. There's a moment you don't forget, even if you try to. It's not loud. It doesn't come with thunder or headlines. It comes quietly, in the still hours, in a moment you didn't plan for, when something inside finally whispers, "This isn't who I am anymore." It's not bitterness. It's not anger. It's something deeper. A realization that the version of you that's been living for everyone else's peace has become a stranger in your own story. You don't recognize your own voice in conversations. You hear yourself saying things that don't reflect what you really believe. You smile and nod, but inside there's a storm, not of rage, but of aching honesty. Because the silence you once used to protect yourself has started to suffocate you. And the parts of you that you silenced to keep the peace are now crying out to be rescued. This isn't rebellion. This is awakening. Your soul has a voice, not a loud, aggressive one, but a wise, steady, holy one. It speaks in tension. It speaks in resistance. It speaks in discomfort. It speaks in the quiet grief of not being fully present in your own life. And for too long, you've labeled that voice as pride, as selfishness, as instability. But what if it was God's mercy wrapped in discomfort? What if your restlessness isn't a lack of peace, but the invitation to find it? See, the soul doesn't rage when it's heard. It rages when it's ignored. And the longer you pretend you're okay, the louder that ache becomes. You were never meant to disappear in the name of faith. You were never created to betray your soul just to fit a version of godliness. that silences your personhood. You were designed in the image of a God who speaks, who creates through sound, who heals through words, who liberates through voice. When Jesus healed, he often began with a question. He asked the blind man, "What do you want me to do for you?" He asked the invalid at the pool, "Do you want to be made well?" He asked the disciples, "Who do you say that I am?" Why? Because healing isn't just divine power. It's mutual honesty. God asks so we remember we have a voice. But if you've lived a life of spiritual silence, those questions can feel terrifying. What do you want? What do you need? What do you believe? When you've been conditioned to default to what others want, those questions feel selfish. But they're not. They're sacred. Because buried beneath your silence is a story full of beauty, pain, and wisdom. A story that deserves to be heard, first by you and then by the world. You might not even realize how long you've been suppressing it. Until someone asks, "How are you?" and your mouth says, "Fine," while your heart screams, "I'm exhausted." Until you're praised for being peaceful, but you leave the room feeling like a ghost. Until the people closest to you say you're easy to love, but deep down, you wonder if they'd still say that if they knew the full truth of you. This tension isn't sin. It's the soul asking for space. And when you start giving it space, even in small ways, things begin to shift. Maybe it looks like journaling honestly for the first time in years, writing things you never said out loud. Maybe it looks like pausing in a conversation and saying, "Actually, I don't agree with that." Maybe it looks like letting someone close enough to hear your actual opinions, not your filtered ones. Maybe it looks like praying with rawness again. Not the polished, perfect phrases, but the kind of prayer that sounds more like groaning than glory. God hears all of it. And He calls it holy. There's a sacredness in reclaiming your voice, not to fight, not to rebel, but to return to yourself, to the image of God that was always in you, even when others taught you to hide it. Because here's the truth. The longer you silence your soul, the easier it becomes to confuse compliance with peace. But peace is not the absence of conflict. It's the presence of truth, even when that truth is disruptive. Real peace doesn't require you to agree with everything. It invites you to bring your full self into the room, trusting that God can hold the tension of your humanity and your holiness. You don't have to choose between being spiritual and being honest. In fact, the most spiritual moments often happen when you stop censoring your truth. Like Hannah at the temple, weeping uncontrollably before God. Like Job, tearing his robe and asking the hardest questions anyone dares to ask. Like David, writing psalms that oscillate between praise and despair. Like Jesus, sweating blood in the garden, whispering, "If it be possible, let this cup pass from me." That's what it looks like to have a soul that speaks, not perfectly, not always softly, but truthfully. And that kind of truth, it heals. It might feel risky. You may lose some comfort. You may unsettle a few relationships, but you will gain something far more sacred. Yourself, your clarity, your strength, your wholeness. And in the end, you'll realize that God never wanted your silence. He wanted your presence, your real, raw, fully alive presence. Because the more you show up as yourself, the more heaven shows up through you. It's a strange kind of grief, waking up to the realization that you've been missing from your own life. Not physically. You've been present in every room, every routine, every service, But emotionally, spiritually, you've been on mute, not because you're weak, not because you lack faith, but because you've been taught, directly or indirectly, that your voice was dangerous. Dangerous to peace, dangerous to order, dangerous to love. So you silenced it. You buried it beneath obedience. You called it humility. And for a while, it worked. Until the ache of invisibility became louder than your fear of being seen. And now, you're here, somewhere between numb and alive, somewhere between comfort and courage. You're starting to feel again. And with every moment of honesty, your voice begins to tremble back into existence. It's not the voice of rebellion. It's not shouting or stomping or demanding. It's quiet, broken, tender, but it's real. And real is the most spiritual thing you can be. You were never designed to be voiceless in the name of peace. You were designed to carry the peace of heaven through your voice, not by silencing yourself, but by showing up fully. And showing up starts with one of the hardest things you'll ever do, telling the truth. The truth about what you want. The truth about what you feel. The truth about what has hurt you. The truth about where you've been silent for too long. This isn't easy. It takes more courage to speak softly from a healed heart than to stay silent behind a wounded one. It takes more strength to say, "This is what I need," than to go another year without asking for it. It takes more faith to believe that God can use your honest voice, not just your holy silence. But here's what you'll start to notice when you do. People may not respond how you expect. Some will misunderstand. Some may distance themselves. But others will exhale when you speak, because your honesty gives them permission to be honest too. Your voice breaks the spell of performance, the quiet agreement we all make to pretend we're fine. Your presence cracks open space for someone else to feel seen. This is how heaven moves. Not always through miracles or signs, but through moments of raw humanity infused with sacred truth. Like when someone finally says, "I've been tired too." Or when you admit, "That boundary is necessary for me right now." Or when you confess, "I haven't felt close to God in months, but I still believe He hasn't left." Those words, whispered with sincerity, not spiritual polish, carry weight. They shake the foundations of shame. They break generational silence. They rebuild the soul from the inside out. Because when you speak from your healed self, or even your healing self, you don't just change your life. You shift atmospheres. And the more you practice, the more you realize your voice was never the problem. It was the missing piece. It's the thread that ties your experience to someone else's deliverance. It's the tool that brings light into rooms where truth has been silenced. It's the gift that reminds the weary they are not alone. You don't need to be loud to be powerful. You don't need to be right to be valuable. You don't need to be perfect to be holy. You just need to be present. And presence, when it includes your truth, is a form of worship. Remember, Jesus didn't die so you could become a quieter version of yourself. He died to set you free. And freedom is noisy sometimes. It's the sound of boundaries being drawn, of no being said with love, of yes being said with courage, of your soul finally speaking after years of holding its breath. This is the sound of restoration, not rebellion, not ego. Just a child of God remembering that she was made to speak, that he was made to stand, that we were made to reflect a God who is not silent. So you start again. You speak kindly. You speak clearly. You speak not to defend or attack, but to exist, fully, beautifully, without apology. And as you do, something sacred returns. your peace. But this time, it's not the peace that requires your silence. It's the kind that wraps around your truth and says, this, too, is holy. And that peace doesn't crumble when you're honest. It deepens. It roots itself. It holds you through the trembling. Because the peace of God doesn't require performance. It welcomes your full humanity. And as that humanity rises, your softness, your boldness, your laughter, your clarity, you become someone others can feel safe around. Not because you're quiet, but because you're real. And that kind of realness, it changes everything. You've spent so much time trying to protect the peace around you that you forgot your soul was never meant to live under a constant hush. You thought that if you just kept things calm, if you avoided tension, if you stayed agreeable, if you sacrificed a few parts of yourself here and there, everyone else would be okay. And maybe they were. But somewhere in the process of keeping things peaceful for others, you stopped being okay. Now you know why you've felt off, why your joy has been half-lit, why conversations feel hollow, why worship sometimes feels like going through the motions. It's not because your faith is weak. It's because your soul has been asking, gently but persistently, to come home to itself, to stop hiding, to stop performing, to stop settling for the kind of peace that costs you your voice. Because peace isn't real if you have to disappear to keep it. And now, as you begin to reclaim your voice, something unexpected starts to rise. Not rebellion, not chaos, but clarity. Clarity that allows you to say, this is what I believe. Clarity that says, this is what I need. Clarity that refuses to trade authenticity for approval, ever again. That's where real peace begins. Not in silence, but in truth. Not in suppressing yourself, but in being so deeply grounded in who God made you that you no longer feel the need to shrink for anyone. Because the God who created the stars also created your voice. And He didn't design it to be buried under politeness, or fear, or performance. He gave it to you so the world could hear Him through the sound of your healed honesty. You don't have to be loud to be holy. You don't have to fight to be heard. You just have to show up with your story, your softness, your scars, your light, and let God speak through all of it. There's no formula, no one right way to take your voice back. Sometimes it's subtle, a boundary you hold when it would have been easier to fold. Sometimes it's direct, a conversation you finally have, even though your hands shake. Sometimes it's internal, simply choosing to no longer believe that your quiet is a spiritual obligation. And sometimes, the loudest reclaiming is the one no one else hears. When you finally tell yourself the truth, I'm allowed to take up space, I'm allowed to disagree, I'm allowed to want more, I'm allowed to need rest, I'm allowed to say no, I'm allowed to say nothing, but not because I'm afraid, because I've chosen stillness, not silence. This is how it begins, with small, sacred decisions to live whole again. Not controlled by what others expect, not confined by what you were taught, but free, steady, rested. This kind of peace, it doesn't come from keeping things calm. It comes from becoming someone who no longer fears their own reflection, someone who no longer avoids their own thoughts, someone who no longer hides their spirit behind quietness that was never their calling. And once you've tasted this peace, the kind that meets you in the truth, not outside of it, you'll stop settling for anything less. You'll stop mistaking spiritual numbness for discipline. You'll stop romanticizing silence that's really suppression. You'll stop letting people's comfort dictate your boundaries. And you'll stop apologizing for being awake in a world that's taught you to sleep through your own life. Because God never wanted your silence. He wanted you. Whole, honest, brave, soft, bold, present. And maybe you're wondering, is it too late? Have I gone too far down this path of disappearing? But it's never too late to return to yourself. Not when the one who made you is still holding space for you to come alive again. So take the first breath, the first word, the first pause where you don't rush to fill the space with what others want to hear. Let that moment be enough. You don't need a crowd to validate it. You don't need applause. You don't need anyone else's permission. You are the permission. Your healing is permission. Your voice, after everything, after the silence, after the pretending, after the shrinking, your voice is the evidence of grace. Because you didn't lose yourself. You just learned, slowly and quietly, how to come back home. And now you get to live differently. Not louder, just clearer. Not harder, just more fully. Not for them, but for him and for you. Welcome back.